René Clair, born René-Lucien Chomette, was a French filmmaker and writer. He first established his reputation in the 1920s as a director of silent films in which comedy was often mingled with fantasy. He went on to make some of the most innovative early sound films in France, before going abroad to work in the UK and USA for more than a decade. Returning to France after World War II, he continued to make films that were characterized by their elegance and wit, often presenting a nostalgic view of French life in earlier years. He was elected to the Académie Française in 1960. Clair's best-known films include the Italian Straw Hat, Under the Roofs of Paris, Le Million, Annonce la Liberté, I Married a Witch, and Then There Were None. Early life. René Clair was born and grew up in Paris in the district of Les Halles, whose lively and picturesque character made a lasting impression on him. His father was a soap merchant. He had an elder brother, Henry Chomette. He attended the Lycée Montaigne and the Lycée Louis le Grand. In 1914 he was studying philosophy. His friends at that time included Raymond Peale, who became the actor and writer for Le Period. In 1917, at the age of 18, he served as an ambulance driver in World War I, before being invalided out with a spinal injury. He was deeply affected by the horrors of war that he witnessed and gave expression to this in writing a volume of poetry called La Tête de l'Homme. Back in Paris after the war, he started a career as a journalist at the left-wing newspaper L'Intransigeant. Film career. Having met the music hall singer Demia and written some songs for her, Clair was persuaded by her to visit Gaumont Studios in 1920, where a film was being cast, and he then agreed to take on a leading role in Le Lister, La Vie. He adopted the stage name of René Clair, and several other acting jobs followed, including Paraset for Louis Feuillade. In 1922, he extended his career as a journalist, becoming the editor of a new film supplement to a monthly magazine, Tête Comédie Illustrée. He also visited Belgium, and after an introduction from his brother Henry, he became an assistant to the director Jacques de Baroncelli on several films. In 1924, with the support of the producer Henry Diamantberger, Clair got the opportunity to direct his own first film, Paris qui dort, a short comic fantasy. Before it had been shown, however, Clair was asked by Francis Picabia and Eric Satie to make a short film to be shown as part of the Dadaist ballet Releg he made in tracks, and it established Clair as a leading member of the Parisian avant-garde. Fantasy and dreams were also components of his next two films. But in 1926 Clair took a new direction when he joined Alexandre Kaminka's Films Albatross company to film a dramatic story, Le Proie du Vent, which met with commercial success. He remained at Albatross for his last two silent films, Un chapeau de paille d'Italien Les Timides, in which he sought to translate the essentially verbal comedy of two plays by Labiche into works of silent cinema. While at Albatross, Clair met the designer Lazare Emerson and the cameraman Georges Perrinel, who were to remain important collaborators with him for the next decade. By the end of the silent era, Clair was celebrated as one of the great names in cinema, alongside Griffith, Chaplin, Pabst and Eisenstein, as the author of all of his own scripts, who also paid close attention to every aspect of the making of a film, including the editing. Clair was one of the first French filmmakers to establish for himself the full role of an auteur. Clair was initially skeptical about the introduction of sound to films, and called it an unnatural creation. He then realized the creative possibilities that it offered, particularly, in his view, if the soundtrack was not used realistically, words and pictures need not, and indeed should not, be tied together in a clumsy duplication of information. Dialogue did not always need to be heard. Between 1930 and 1933, Clair explored these ideas in his first four sound films. starting with Sous les toits de Paris. This was followed by Le Million, Un Aus la Liberté, and 14 Juillet. All of these films portrayed an affectionate and idealized view of working-class life, and they did much to create a popular romantic image of Paris which was seen around the world. When Chaplin made Modern Times in 1936, it was noted that some parts of it bore a marked similarity to scenes in Un Aus la Liberté, and the French producers launched a lawsuit for plagiarism against United Artists, the producers of Chaplin's film. Clair was embarrassed by this since he acknowledged his own debt to the spirit of Chaplin, and he refused to be associated with the action. After the immense success of these early sound films, Clair met with a major setback when his next film, Le Dernier Milliardaire, was a critical and commercial flop. While he was visiting London for the film's British premiere, he met Alexander Korda, who offered him a contract to work in England. He accepted, and began a lengthy period of exile from filmmaking in France. Clair's contract with Korda's London Films was for 2 years and it envisaged 3 films. Because of his limited English, he collaborated with the American dramatist Robert E. Sherwood as scriptwriter for his first film, The Ghost Goes West, a comic fantasy about transatlantic culture or clash. Clair and Sherwood became close friends. In January 1936, Clair visited America for 2 weeks, checking out for future employment possibilities but still planning to remain with Korda. Korda, however, rejected Clair's next script and they parted company. Clair's remaining time in England led to only one more completed film, Break the News, a musical comedy with Jack Buchanan and Maurice Chevalier. Returning to France, Clair attempted to make another film there in 1939, Airport, which was to be a celebration of youth and childhood. But the outbreak of war interrupted filming and it was abandoned. In May 1940, Jean Girardot, then Minister of Information, suggested to Clair that the film profession should concentrate its resources in the south of country in Nice and Marseille, and, if necessary, establish a French production center in the United States. It was with this last plan in mind that Clair and his family, along with Julien Duvivier, departed for America. But by the time he reached New York, the project had already fallen through and he went straight on to Hollywood, where several studios were interested in employing him. He made his first American film for Universal Studios, The Flame of New Orleans. But it was such a commercial failure that for a time Clair's career as a director was in the balance. After more than a year's delay, his next film was I Married a Witch, followed by It Happened Tomorrow, both of which did respectably well. And then There Were None, which turned out to be an exceptional commercial success despite being perhaps the least personal of his Hollywood ventures. Each of Clair's American films was made for a different studio. In 1941, Clair was stripped of his French citizenship by the Vichy government, though this was later reversed. It was also in 1941 that he learned of the death of his brother René Chomette in France from polio. In 1943, he was planning to go to Algeria to organize the Service Cinématographique de l'Arménie, but funding for the project was withdrawn just as he was on the point of departure. In July 1945, he went back to France for a short visit, and then returned finally in July 1946, having signed a contract with RKO for his next film to be made in France. Clair's American exile had allowed him to develop his characteristic vein of ironical fantasy with several commercially successful films. But there was some feeling that it had been at the expense of personal control and that his output had not matched the quality of his earlier work in France. Clair himself recognized that being employed by the highly organized American studios had allowed him to work in ideal circumstances. In spite of the restrictions of the American system, it is possible, if one wishes, to take responsibility. In my 4 Hollywood films I managed to do what I wanted. Clair's first film on his return to France was the romantic comedy Le Silence est d'Or, which was set in 1906 and nostalgically evoked the world of early French filmmaking. Its plot also created variations on Molière's L'école des Femmes. Clair considered it one of his best post-war films. Literary inspirations also underpinned other films: Faust for la beauté du diable, and Don Juan for les grands manœuvres. In these two films and the intervening Les Belles de Nuit, the leading actor was Gérard Philippe, who became a friend and a favorite performer for Clair. Porte des Lilas was a somber film, set once again in a popular district of Paris with its picturesque inhabitants, for which the singer Georges Brassens was persuaded to give his first and only film performance. During the 1950s, as a new generation of French critics and filmmakers emerged who were impatient of the prevailing modes of film production, Clair found himself increasingly criticized as a representative of the cinéma de qualité, a cinema of old men, dominated by nostalgia for the younger days. His status as a figure of the establishment was further confirmed by his election to the Académie Française in 1960. Although he continued to make a few more films in comic vein such as Tableau du Monde, they were not well received, and he made his last film, Les Fêtes Galantes, in 1965. Writing and later work. Clair began his career as a journalist, and writing remained an important interest for him, to which he increasingly turned in his later years. In 1926 he published a novel, Adams, about a Hollywood star for whom the distinction between the real and unreal becomes blurred. He occasionally returned to writing fiction, but many of his publications dealt with the cinema, including reflections on his own films. Apart from many journal articles, his main publications were Adams, English translation, Starturned, Réflexion Fate, English translation, Reflections on the Cinema, La Princesse de Chine, Suivida de fil en aiguille, Comédies et commentaires, English translation, in part, 4 screenplays, Disques de réception à l'Académie Française, Tableau du Monde, Cinéma d'hier, Cinéma d'aujourd'hui, English translation, Cinema Yesterday and Today, L'étrange ouvrage des years d'après the Dutch courtesan de John Marston, Jeux de Hasard, Écoutes et Nouvelles. Clair also ventured into other media. In 1951 he directed his first radio production, Une Larme du Diable. In 1959 he directed a stage production of Musets en Ibadine par avec l'amour, in which Gérard Philippe gave one of his last performances before his death. In 1972 he staged Luxor Fayet for the Paris Opera. Personal life. At the end of 1924, while Clair was working on Ciné Sketch for the theatre with France Picabia, he first met a young actress, Bronya Perlmutter, who subsequently appeared in his film Le Voyage Imaginaire, premiered at the newly opened Studio des Ursulines. They married in 1926, and the son, Jean-François, was born in 1927. René Clair died at home on the 15th of March 1981, and he was buried privately at Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois. Reputation. Clair's reputation as a filmmaker underwent a considerable re-evaluation during the course of his own lifetime. In the 1930s he was widely seen as one of France's greatest directors, alongside Renoir and Carnet, but thereafter his work's artifice and detachment from the realities of life fell increasingly from favor. The avant-gardism of his first films, and especially in tracks, had given him a temporary notoriety. and a grounding in surrealism continued to underlie much of his comedy work. It was, however, the imaginative manner in which he overcame his initial skepticism about the arrival of sound which established his originality, and his first 4 sound films brought him international fame. Clair's years of working in the UK and USA made him still more widely known, but did not show any marked development in his style or thematic concerns. It was in the post-war films that he made on his return to France that some critics have observed a new maturity and emotional depth, accompanied by a prevailing sense of melancholy but still framed by the elegance and wit that characterized his earlier work. However, in the 1950s, the critics who heralded the arrival of the French New Wave, especially those associated with Coheres du cinéma, found Clair's work old-fashioned and academic. François Truffaut wrote harshly of him after seeing The Flame of New Orleans. "We don't follow our elders in paying the same tribute to Renoir and Clair. There is no film by Clair which matches the invention and wit of Renoir's tir au flanc. Clair makes films for old ladies who go to the cinema twice a year." André Bazin, the founding editor of Coheres, made a more measured assessment. René Clair has remained in a way a filmmaker of the silent cinema. Whatever the quality and importance of his recent films, expression through the image always predominates over that of the word, and one almost never misses the essence if one can only vaguely hear the dialogue. Quote, "It was also in a special number of Coheres du cinéma reviewing the current state of the French cinema in 1957 that Clair received one of his most positive appreciations. A complete film author who, since the silent era, has brought to the French cinema intelligence, refinement, humor, an intellectual quality that is slightly dry but smiling and in good taste. Whatever may follow in his rich career, he has created a cinematic world that is his own, full of rigor and not lacking in imagination, thanks to which he remains one of our greatest filmmakers. Such appreciations have subsequently been rare, and the self-contained artificiality of Clair's films, his insistence on the meticulous preparation of an often literary script, and his preference for filming in studio sets rather than on location increasingly set him apart from modern trends in filmmaking. The paradox of Clair's reputation has been further heightened by those commentators who have seen François Truffaut as the French cinema's true successor to Clair, notwithstanding the occasions of the mutual disdain. Filmography: feature films, short films in tracks. Paris Qui Dort, Paris Asleep, The Crazy Ray, La Tour, Forever and a Day, La Française et l'amour, Love and the Frenchwoman, Les Quatre Vérités, Three Fables of Love, television, Les Fables de La Fontaine. Awards and honors: René Clair held the national honors of Grand Officier de la Légion d'Honneur, Commander des Arts et des Lettres, and Grand Croix de l'Ordre National du Mérite. He received the Grand Prix du Cinéma Français in 1953. In 1956 he was awarded an honorary doctorate by the University of Cambridge. In 1960 he was elected to the Académie Française. He was not the first filmmaker so honored. Jean Cocteau and Marcel Achard, but he was the first to be elected primarily as a filmmaker. In 1994 the Académie established the Prix René Clair as an annual prize awarded to a distinguished filmmaker. In 1967 he received an honorary doctorate from the Royal College of Art in London, as well as many awards made for individual films. Clair received an honorary prize at the 11th Moscow International Film Festival in 1979 for his contribution to cinema.